There's a comedian named Daniel Tosh who had a real good run in the 20-teens. I think he was a pastor's kid. That's kind of wild when I discovered that, because do not bring the kids along to the Daniel Tosh Comedy Hour. He did a show, I don't remember where it was, maybe Comedy Central. And it was, it's fairly raunchy. He's a comedian. It was the 20-teens. But one of the little skits, the little bits that he would do on this show is that he would bring people in from the internet who had colossally failed, if you will, in front of bajillions of people on a video that went viral. And he'd bring them in and he would do something called a web redemption. And again, even though I do not recommend going and watching Tosh.0 or Daniel, I don't know, you're smart. You do whatever you want. You're smart. Even though it might not be my first recommendation ever for each and every one of you, I would say this. The fact that he was raised around the idea of God's redemptive plan and the importance of redemption came through in a way I found kind of charming in this little bit that he would do called, again, web redemptions. Because he would set up the whole elaborate scenario of the moment of failure from these viral videos, and then he would give the person who failed in the video a chance to redeem themselves and have it go better the second time around. It's all very tongue-in-cheek and facetious. I mean, this is not like some kind of feel-good show like whenever that Thai guy would go and rebuild your house in 2 days while your family's at Disneyland or whatever. It's not like that at all. It's tongue-in-cheek redemption. But it was there, and he would always be like, all right, so-and-so, are you ready to try it again? Or are you ready to redeem? I don't remember exactly what he would say, but there's always this moment of like, I have set it up so that you are right back to the point of this test. Are you ready to take another shot at it? Are you ready to pass the test this time around? And yesterday and today, that's what we're looking at as we are looking at Act 3 of the rebuilding of the temple narrative through the first half of the book of Ezra. And what we're already seeing is that Zerubbabel and the Jews who went back to rebuild the temple during the reign of Cyrus and Darius, it looks like there's been some growth on their part, and they're about to be confronted with a test they failed, a hurdle they could not clear 10, 12, 15 years earlier in the story, as the work on the house of God in Jerusalem came to a standstill during that time. That's what it says in Ezra 4:24. But now, Haggai and Zechariah, the prophets, have been raised up, and they grabbed everybody by the shoulders and shook and grabbed everybody by the lips and yanked, and now everybody's all worked up and ready to get back to work on the temple, and there's this new energy for everything, but then they run into what got them last time. Political opposition, getting on the radar of powerful political people and not being able to outmaneuver them, not being able to manage their relationships with local powerful people well enough. Are they going to pass the test this time or not? Are Zerubbabel and the exiled Jews who went to rebuild the temple ready to redeem themselves? Well, it turns out, yeah, or they're ready to be redeemed. They clear the hurdle in chapters 5 and 6. They curry some kind of favor with their local governor, Tattenai, who doesn't know what to do with them starting to rebuild the temple again. It's not familiar to him. That's from a bygone administration under Darius's predecessor, Cyrus. And then he writes a letter, Tattenai does, to Darius, and Darius receives it well. And he's like, let's do a search for that. I think that's important. And in Ezra 6:2, a scroll was found in the citadel of Ecbatana in the province of Media, and this was written on it. Memorandum. This is another one of those block quotes. It's from the archives. In the first year of King Cyrus, the king issued a decree concerning the temple of God in Jerusalem. Let the temple be rebuilt as a place to present sacrifices, and let its foundations be laid. It is to be 90 feet high and 90 feet wide, with 3 courses of large stones and 1 of timbers. The costs are to be paid by the royal treasury. Also, the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon. That was in 586 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar of the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and the temple and took away all the stuff and brought everybody into exile. Those are to be returned to their places in the temple in Jerusalem. They are to be deposited in the house of God. So this is interesting. Darius's inquiry actually gives us a little bit more information and insight into the fullness of Cyrus's decree, which we get a little bit of at the end of 2 Chronicles, which we get a little bit more of in the prologue to this 3-act structure of the rebuilding the temple story in Ezra chapter 1, and which now we get even more of in what was apparently another decree or an expanded version of the decree that has been in storage since the time of Cyrus here in Ezra 6. So then this reply of Darius pivots from being in the voice of Cyrus, quoting King Cyrus from the past. It pivots into now being in the voice of Darius himself. And he says, all right, Tattenai, governor of this particular satrapy, we're going to go even bigger. We're doing what Cyrus said, and we're funding it harder. And if anybody gets in the way, impale them on a pole from their own house. Nobody is to obstruct this. We are going to get that thing built. I, Darius, have decreed it. Let it be carried out with diligence. So was there going to be redemption here? Were they going to clear the hurdle? Were they going to pass the test that could not be passed last time around? Oh, heck yeah. And with flying colors. So now it's all downhill from here. All you got to do is just build the thing. Everything is in order. Verse 13. Then, because of the decree King Darius had sent, Tattenai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Sethar-Bozenai and their associates carried it out with diligence. So the elders of the Jews continued to build and prosper under the preaching of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah, a descendant of Iddo. They finished building the temple according to the command of the God of Israel and the decrees of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, kings of Persia. The temple was completed on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. Now, again, that could be a little bit confusing because the author of Ezra is very comfortable jumping totally out of time to give us the big picture of how rebuilding and how all of this process went. So he's done that once already, you'll recall, in chapter 4, or Act 2, as we're calling it, where he traced all of the resistance to the rebuilding all the way up from Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, all the way up to Artaxerxes. It's like 80 years of resistance. And now he is completing that. Dun, 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 dun. That's still lingering out there. Dun, dun. That completion happens right here, as he says, the temple got built. So all of the resistance over all of those ages was defeated over all of those ages. And even though it happens a little bit out of time chronologically, he's saying the real spike of the football here, the real celebratory moment that is testimony to all of that resistance being defeated, is the building and still standingness of the temple. Verse 16, we're in celebration mode now. Then the people of Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the rest of the exiles celebrated the dedication of the house of God with joy. For the dedication of this house of God, they offered 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 male lambs, and a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats, one for each of the tribes of Israel. And they installed the priests in their divisions and the Levites in their groups for the service of God at Jerusalem, according to what is written in the book of Moses. Now, I'm just going to keep reading a few more verses that describe how all of this went down. On the 14th day of the first month, the exiles celebrated the Passover. So you see what's happening here? We had two goals, right, in this rebuilding thing. The obvious one was rebuild the physical temple, but the less obvious, but maybe more important one, was rebuild the people, rebuild the union between these broken, dinged up, damaged people who God says he still has plans for in a good way, to rebuild the relationship between them and God. On the 14th day of the first month, the exiles celebrated the Passover in keeping with that second goal. The priests and Levites had purified themselves and were all ceremonially cleaned. The Levites slaughtered the Passover lamb for all the exiles, for their brothers, the priests, and for themselves. So the Israelites who had returned from the exile ate it, together with all who had separated themselves from the unclean practices of their Gentile neighbors in order to seek the Lord, the God of Israel. There you have it. We accomplished objective one. The temple is built and dedicated, and it sounds here like there's a lot of optimism that objective two is either accomplished or well on its way to being accomplished. For 17 days, they celebrated with joy the Feast of Unleavened Bread because the Lord had filled them with joy. And there's one interesting thing I want to note before we just call it good and celebrate the fact together that we have now gone through all three acts of this beautiful story of the rebuilding of the temple that sets up everything in Nehemiah. Do you remember a few chapters back, roughly 20 years before the completion and dedication of the temple, when they dedicated the walls, and some of the really old people could remember what Solomon's temple looked like, and so they cried and wailed at this new, smaller footprint because they viewed it as a metaphor for what had gone wrong. But the young people were like, this is great, it's super, it's the biggest temple I've ever seen, this is awesome, we're winning. And they all celebrated, and the cacophony of the mourning and the celebration was so loud that it could be heard for miles away, but nobody knew exactly how to interpret it because it was mixed emotions. And do you notice how that doesn't happen here? Sure, the sacrifice sacrifices to initiate the dedication of the temple are way fewer than the number of sacrifices that were given at the dedication of Solomon's temple 500-ish years earlier. Well, not quite 500 years, but roughly that. And sure, when the tabernacle, the tent of the presence of God, way back in the desert wandering 900-ish years before the stuff we're looking at here in Ezra happened, and when the dedication of Solomon's temple, whatever we're saying, 450-ish years before all of this happened, when that occurred, there was a visible presence of God. He showed up in fire and cloud and smoke, and it was physically evident to everybody, God dwells here. That doesn't happen this time around, sure. But despite those two realities, we don't get the mourning this time. Everybody's just celebrating. So what is that about? Well, I think it's about two things. One, everybody who remembered maybe died in those 20 years that ensued between the one and the other. So that living memory has gone away. We see that motif of a certain generation passing away before the next thing can happen back in the desert wandering as well. But also, I think there's an added layer of celebration here because they tried to pass the test, failed to pass the test, went into mourning and disappointment phase. It seemed like there was a narrative written in stone, and then they and God shook things up, and they overcame a hurdle that they couldn't clear before. There was a redemption here. It's a great web redemption, except without all of the irony and snark. This one is just real. It's just a straight up redemption, a defeating and unmaking of a story that seemed written in stone. And yesterday I got all sappy at the end, and I probably shouldn't do it 2 days in a row because it's just not what we do, but I'm totally going to do it. Redemption is a real thing. It's my favorite story in the world. I've seen it in other people's lives. I've seen it in my own. And so many of those stories that seem like are just written in stone because we're damaged goods and that's just how things are going to be forever. It turns out that they're not that way, and that the God who was really into redemption in the Bible is still really into that in ways that maybe aren't quite as grand as the rebuilding of a temple or whatever, but where the impulse is just the same and the impact is just as recognizable in the life of the person who is touched by those narrative-breaking moments by the power of God. And I think that stuff happens. I think that stuff is real. I know not all of you believe that. I know not all of you are coming from the same posture in this conversation of belief, but that's where I'm coming from. And so stories like what we talked about the last couple of days, I find to be really interesting and really encouraging from the big, grand narrative, historical, Bible perspective, but also this gets into the personal a little bit. So thank you for indulging me on that these last couple of days. Whew, I went forever today. All right, I'm going to be quiet. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.